Hi everyone, and welcome back to Shukin Science. In this video, we'll go through and label all the parts of the ear and talk about how all these structures work together to facilitate the process of hearing, starting with the structures of the outer ear. So the outer ear are obviously the easiest to identify. They are these flaps of cartilage that we're all familiar with, known as the pinna. And really, the only purpose of these exterior portions of our ears is to help take all of the wavelengths of sound that are bouncing around us and funnel them into the middle portion of our ear called the ear canal or auditory canal. So this is how we get those wavelengths of sound into our ears to be processed by our brains. Now, once those wavelengths are funneled into the auditory canal, the first structure that they're actually going to interact with is this band of tissue or this membrane called the tympanum. You've probably also heard this referred to as the eardrum. And the whole goal of the eardrum is to take those waves of sound that are pushing against it and push against more things. So when the sound waves push against the tympanum, it's going to push against this first teeny tiny bone in the middle of our ear. And then that's going to push on the second teeny tiny bone and the third teeny tiny bone. Collectively, these three bones are known as the ossicles. And their job is to amplify the waves of sound that are being delivered to them by the tympanum. So by the time those waves or changes in pressure reach the last ossicle, we have a much greater pressure difference compared to when they originally entered our ears. The last ossicle is then going to push against another membrane that is very similar to the tympanum, and that one is called the the oval window. Easy to get them mixed up. And the oval window now accepts a much more intense change in pressure compared to what the tympanum had accepted. Now, when that oval window accepts the changes in pressure, it is also going to push against something. And this time, the thing that it's pushing against is the fluid that is in this big snail shell looking structure called the cochlea. Okay, so this entire long windy tube is the cochlea, and as it accepts changes in pressure, the fluid basically creates waves. And with each wave, these teeny tiny hair cells that are embedded in this structure here called the organ of Corti, those tiny little hair cells, they basically vibrate in response to all the waves that are going on in that fluid within the cochlea. And every time one of those hair cells vibrates, it generates an action potential, which is then picked up by this nerve here, called the auditory nerve, sometimes also called the cochlear nerve. And then those action potentials are sent to the temporal lobe of the brain for processing. Now, I wanted to state, I'm kind of oversimplifying what is happening inside the cochlea. This organ of Corti is actually embedded within a structure that has several different layers. For the purposes of our curriculum, we just need to know that the organ of Corti is a structure within the cochlea that contains hair cells, and it's those tiny little hair cells that vibrate in response to changes in pressure, which activates the auditory nerve. Now, because those hair cells activate in response to changes of pressure, they are referred to as mechanoreceptors. And mechanoreceptors are actually found in one other location in the inner ear, and that is these structures here, known as the semicircular canals. Now, before I talk about what happens in those really, really interesting places, we do need to recognize that as pressure builds in the cochlea, it does need to be released eventually. You can't have pressure building and building in that location forever. So as the pressure builds, it can then be released through this tiny little membrane, and that one is called the round window. So as pressure gets too high, it then leaves the inner ear, comes back into the middle ear section, but instead of bouncing back out of the pinna, it actually gets funneled down through another tube here called the eustachian tube. And the eustachian tube, oddly enough, connects to the backs of our throats. That's why if you feel pressure building in your ears, say when you're flying or hiking at high elevations, you can actually help to pop your ears or release that pressure by yawning. That's because it basically allows that extra pressure to escape through that eustachian tube into the backs of our throats. Okay, so that is the process of hearing. Every structure I just labeled has an important role in delivering an action potential to the brain to be interpreted. But like I said, there's some other structures in this inner ear, and we actually sometimes refer to these structures as the labyrinth because they are so complex. For our purposes, we call these big, long, windy tubes at the top the semicircular canals. And the semicircular canals, like I mentioned, also have teeny tiny hair cells or mechanoreceptors that do respond to changes in pressure. However, the pressure changes that take place inside of these canals have nothing to do with waves of sound. Instead, the fluid that circulates through these long windy tubes, that fluid moves in response to changes in our head position. So anytime we tilt our head or rotate around, that is what triggers movements in the fluid of the semicircular canals. And then hair cells within the semicircular canals vibrate just like in the cochlea. And when they vibrate, they produce action potential, which is then picked up by this nerve here called the vestibular nerve. Now, that nerve can go to several different locations in the brain, one of which includes the cerebellum. And so actually the purpose of the semicircular canals is to help maintain our dynamic equilibrium or our balance. They're the reason why you can move around and not fall over most of the time. Okay, so even though the semicircular canals are part of this inner ear, even though they use very similar strategies as the cochlea, they actually have nothing to do with hearing and everything to do with helping us to maintain our balance.